Tales for Dark Nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs, and become a patron today to show your support and get instant access to our extensive archive of downloadable ad-free tales of terror. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
And we're back, folks, kicking off Season 7 with a bang. If you're just joining us, I'm your host, Erik Peabody. This season incorporates a lot of changes, with the first being the new host intro and theme song, composed by yours truly. I hope that you're just as excited as I am to jump right into Season 7 and wet your fangs. We have a lot of great stories lined up for you this season, and I know I'm just gnashing my teeth to get into them. So without further ado, let's jump into Season 7. You're listening to the standard edition of this program. If you'd like to show your support and enjoy ad-free versions of this and hundreds of tales from our audio archives dating back to 2012, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today to get instant access from our friends at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Did I mention they were ad-free? Thank you for your support. Tonight's story comes to us from author Tom Farr and is titled The Bat House. He turned away from the group and went quickly down the road and on into the woods. A voice called, "Bradley!" behind him, but he paid it no heed. He began to move faster and faster until he was almost running full tilt through the trees, the dark boles clocking by on either side, malign and injurious shapes among which he floundered in full flight. Gradually, he began to slow. He could feel something cold seeping through him, like water through a rockery, and was suddenly aware that what he could see of his surroundings he did not recognize. The trees loomed enormously and closed him in, the spaces between them grown thick with tangled shrubs and thorn bushes, muricate coils of bramble against which dead leaves and other refuse had been blown by the winds and there impaled. He slowed to a walk and then sat down on the trunk of a rather deformed tree that had fallen like some colossal android whose circuitry has shorted. His hands trembled, and every breath raked white-hot coals through his lungs. He sat there for a minute or three, alert for any sounds of voices on the cold autumn air, footsteps, laughter, old dry sticks crunching underfoot. Nothing. No noise at all save his own breath and his pounding blood, and a bird calling from some dim and bowered solitude, thin and fading, forever lost. At length, and with his breath still roaring like a furnace in his chest, he stood and looked around, cradled as he was in a grail of quietude and gathering dusk. Bare branches, bitter trees, damp and spongy earth, lacquered with mulchy leaves and snaked with knobby, slug-white roots reared out of the miry black ground like alien tendrils testing for life. To the west lay a slope where his own harried passage had crashed through brush and bracken, and beyond this he could see sourceless and spectral the faint tow-colored light of the sun. And here, he blinked, squinted hard into the wan unraveling of light with a feeling nigh to unease. Through the tangled latticework of tree branches engraved upon the sky, he could make out the dark angle of a steep roof line intersecting the horizon. As he looked, some small bird that was to his eye somehow ill-shapen tumbled over the roof, fluttered, returned. Then another. Then more. Hundreds of them, darting and checking across the watered sky. The rising apprehension in the pit of his stomach tightened like someone doing a knot. Without really knowing why, he set off towards the building. It just seemed to draw him, the way a magnet draws iron. He began a careful ascent of the gently rising slope, picking his way among hornbeam and yew with the straw-colored light of sunset burning its way towards him. As he drew nearer to the building, his brain finally caught up with a noise he'd been hearing but had not entirely registered. A constant, reedy squeaking, incessant, pervasive, as of the numberless cries of some tremendous nest of mice. He paused uncertainly against the vine-encrusted trunk of a black and mournful cedar and glanced once over his shoulder, as if perhaps he might turn back. The clearing from which he'd climbed lay silent and still. A barren gallery told in blue-black shades of lengthening shadow that he couldn't help but feel had been just quit by another, some medieval ghost with eyes to the ground, hobbling with hymnal and cowl. He pushed the thought aside and turned and walked on. When he came over the crest of the slope, he understood. Not birds after all. A few meters in front of him stood a new-looking metal sign that read, "Bat House," in black letters on a yellow field. Below this, in slightly smaller letters, "Do not enter without a bat license. All bats and their roosts are protected by law." Bradley lifted his eyes from the words on the sign to the house where it stood before him. It was a laurel-colored weatherboard with a sharply gabled bitumen roof fitted tightly to the fascia boards, a dark monolith elevated by a quartet of stilts, so that it resembled some strange angular bug raised up on tiptoe. A constant stream of bats started to and fro from the bottom of the building and out of the tops of the trees like rough shapes of ash scattered by the luminous wind of sunset. He walked slowly towards the bat house, as if all the years of his young life had been honed down to this single moment, to the cries of bats washing over him from out of the darkling trees, primal and myth-laden, urging him on into the deepening shadows taking hold of the land. Those red-eyed basilisks, cast in miniature, scions of Camazots, or the doomed Princess Leotogi. Their shrill chorale seeping through the cracks of a darker world, where light itself is at a premium, and those who dwell there have neither love nor affinity for it. There was a ladder beneath the building, rising dizzily to where a small hatch was set into the floor for access. He drifted to a halt just at the edge of the cool blue penumbra of the building's shadow proper. He stood, watching up at the ladder, and the dark leathery shapes of bats dropping plumb and sheer from a sunless, slatted under-region of seething wings and blackness. A blackness studded with brightly pupilled rubies, myriad blood-red eyes that glowed like coals in a grate. A panoply of otherworldly creatures to this sad corporeal medium forever bound. Beasts with no other origin save for the dark itself, to which they are clan and kin. He woke that night from a dream of wings to a memory of the day that had gone before, of Lucas and the other boys. "Hey, Four Eyes, where are you going?" Then George grabbing him by the shoulder and pushing him down the crowded corridor towards the toilets, while the rest of the boys slouched along behind. The other kids glancing away, studying their bags and their hands as intently as if they'd never seen them before, and those few who dared meet his eyes looking at him like a piece of unexploded ordnance, a bomb that is about to go off. He pushed back the covers and climbed out of bed, groped for his glasses and put them on, and went barefoot across the carpet to the window, pulling back the curtains to decode the star-stitched tapestry of night through fogged and bleary glass. His bedroom window faced the back of the house and looked out upon the neighboring gardens. He wiped a swath of condensation clear with his palm and caught a glimpse of a deep orange moon with bearing branches clawing at its face like sorcerers casting spells to drag it closer to Earth. An infernal candle flaring above a black and silver nightscape of television aerials and chimney pots. A thing so huge he felt as though he could reach up and touch it. Far to the east, a pale band of stars shone and flared like spiracles through which the night itself had drawn a covert breath. The gardens, with their lawns and sheds, were all shadow and moonlight, and where ponds and bird baths stood, they quaked in the moon's ochreous crucible, like softly shirring vats of quicksilver. He turned away. The light through the window was just enough to lighten the walls and summon a few familiar shapes from the otherwise murk of the bedroom. Wardrobe, television, the long white boxes stacked against the far wall, boxes full of comic books and paperbacks and old handed-down penny dreadfuls with yellowed pages that were as cracked and brittle as the memories of those who'd handed them. An assemblage of fiction from which he could conjure up a world of the weird and fantastical to his order. He crossed to the boxes and retrieved a dog-eared paperback, the cover of which was embellished with some ghoul or gremlin scaling a crumbling stone wall, and opened it to a page at random. The pale watching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church. After a while, he returned to bed, but he could not sleep. He lay in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling with a ringing emptiness loud in his ears and the moon's timorous radiance tiptoeing first across the carpet and then the bedclothes, winking off his upturned glasses where they lay on the bedside table. Pale and skeletal shapes slunk along the fringes of his consciousness. Nightmare hounds trotting to and back just beyond his vision, their white teeth shining in the cold blue light of an unknown astronomy. Eventually, he began to drift. Then he awoke. He heard a bang on the window and came to. A heavy wing beat as of some great bird trapped in the room. Heart thudding at the base of his throat, he raised himself up on his elbows, just in time to catch a glimpse of some dark and bat-shaped creature veer and flutter away across a duly furbished disk of moon, like the shadow of a mote in a vacuous eye, or a lone animalcule seen on a slide. The next day, Bradley left school early by way of a spurious sick note scribbled by a credulous nurse, grateful to whatever god or deity dealt his hand that, for once, his cards hadn't come straight from the bottom of the deck. As he passed along the back of the English block, he glanced into a classroom window and saw Lucas gazing abstractedly out, his eyes unused and vacant like holes in a mask. Then, the eyes cut to Bradley in an instant of recognition, and he could see the pasty hatred rising up in their depths, a familiar of the coarse laughter, the blocked doors, the beatings he couldn't escape. Features encoded with no expression save for that of promised threat. Lucas mouthed some unheard imprecation and made to rise from his desk. Bradley hurried on. He arrived at the woods well before sunset, and with time enough to retrace yesterday's steps in the fuller light of that breezy autumn day. He left the road in the same spot, making his way slowly through the disrobed trees, a dank, serried gloom smelling of wet leaves, animal dens, the season's many rains. The sun was faint and foreign through the bowering canopy of branches. The way was at once unknown and vaguely familiar, like a landscape glimpsed in a dream. There were trees he recognized and trees he did not. A sunlit bank of coppery bracken, a gray squirrel vanishing up the trunk of a sycamore tree. He went on. Soon, the carpet of damp leaves thinned to a loamy mulch, and then he was ascending a slope grown thickly with brittle vegetation that broke at his passing. And it was hard going until he emerged at the summit to pick his way through a spinney of saplings and brush, where a brace of pigeons exploded out and fared away with harried wingbeat. Before 30 minutes passed, he came upon the bat house again, a dark and depthless woodcut jigsawed from the neutral gray of the sky. It looked somehow out of place among the naked trees, as if somewhere there had been some random graphical glitch, some curious aberrance in the source code of that place. He studied the building, an asylum for the damned or otherwise undone, wherein they might seek shelter from the earth and all its weathers, its ever-present fireball of a sun, house of Mother Church and her dark matrons, disciples to the coming dusk. But where in this occult and aberrant tableau does dwell the Christ, the Father God? And at what black hour of the night does the liturgy of the Eucharist begin? This time there was nothing to hold him back, no seed of doubt to fester and flourish and drop its bitter fruits. He was about 3/4 of the way up the ladder when he heard the voice, soft and sibilant, to set his very bones on edge, to seize his heart with claws of clammy fear. And now, a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Taking a quick break here to show some love to a sponsor that's shown so much to us, BetterHelp Online Therapy. I love to read books and play games on my phone in my downtime. I once knew someone a long time ago that had to avoid certain types of television because they got too invested. If something bad happened in the show, it would cause them deep emotional unrest for the remainder of the day. Then, on the other hand, I also had a friend who literally cried when he noticed a scratch on his used car. My point is that the smallest things can grab the investment of your time and emotional resources. Sadly, too often your own mental health isn't something that's on that list. I admit that in the past, checking in on my mental health wasn't something I thought about much, if at all, really. We all know how our mind affects how we experience life, so it's important to invest time and care into keeping it healthy. There are plenty of ways to support a healthy brain, like learning a new language or skill. However, there's also BetterHelp Online Therapy. BetterHelp is online therapy that'll help you deal with life's difficulties, quickly, conveniently, and inexpensively. It's helped me through countless situations. Within 48 hours of signing up, you'll be communicating with a therapist who specializes in your unique difficulties, whether it be grief, stress, anxiety, fear, depression, etc. You can text anytime and schedule calls or Zoom meetings weekly. With BetterHelp, help is never more than a text away. It's professional counseling in your pocket. Horror Hill podcast listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/horrorhill. That's BetterHelp.com/horrorhill. Hurry up, boy. Liquid syllables hissing out, uncoiling down the back of his brain like Indian ink dispersing in limpid water. A stain extinguished in encephalic depths, or perhaps to color them indelibly with some dark clarity. Numberless voices intoning his name as one. He froze, the smooth metal rungs of the ladder suddenly slippery beneath his sweating palms. He glanced down at the much diminished ground below, and when his head began to violently reel at this sudden unspooling of distance, he forced himself to look up again at the hatch ahead, from which he thought the voice had issued, although it had sounded as if it had been speaking in his head. He could hear a faint murmuring of squeaks, rustlings, a slow creak in the wooden boards directly above him, as if someone unseen adjusting their weight. Suddenly, he became very conscious of the ladder through his shoes and the nothingness that yawned to engulf him should he but misplace a single step. To see the bat house yanked upwards, sucked away to where the light merged seamlessly with the vaulted heavens as he himself plummeted towards the surface of the earth. He squeezed his eyes shut tight and opened them again and began to essay a slow descent. He was just over halfway down when he glanced up and saw that the hatch was now open, a dark atavistic portal, but dimly defined against a darker plane of shadows. A wind with teeth in it swept down and tugged at his clothing with a long hissing sound like rainfall, like someone whispering his name. Bradley, 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 Bradley. By the time he'd reached the ground, the bats were beginning to defile down through the slats beneath the house, a fluttering black ribbon rapidly thickening to a stream. Thousands of squeaking fiends, pug-nosed and prick-eared with hot red eyes like shards chipped off rubies, calling first each to the other, and then calling to him, brother to brother. Their voices much like those innumerable cries old King Popio must have heard prior to being eaten alive by mice. He stood for a while and watched the dusk unlock the truer form of night in fiery increments of burnt orange and cadmium yellow. And then, finally, with his breath pluming whitely in the cold air, he climbed back up the ladder and entered into the bat house. And when, at length, he came back down, the moon in her gauzy silver clothes was nigh to rise, and the bats were frenzied and seemed to feed on the light itself, and he knew what it was that he must do. Bradley pushed himself to his knees, head clouded by the force of the punch. Bright taste of blood in the back of his mouth like an old penny lodged beneath his tongue. It had begun to rain. The puddles on the ground were full of rings and leaden with the sky's splenetic reflection. His face felt strangely naked for the interminable moment in which he groped about in the mud for his glasses. An old pair. He'd worn them because the left lens of his other pair was cracked by a similar punch. a similar hand. He waited, breathing heavily with his glasses cupped protectively in one hand. Someone said, "Fucking loser," and someone else laughed raucously. He heard the faint, wet sucking sound of shoes in mud, footsteps crossing the field, and gone. When he fumbled the glasses back onto his face, the gray and rain-bleared world swam back into focus. The empty football pitch with its dirty white goalposts, forlorn and netless. To the east, a windswept tennis court, where rain fell slantwise in the wind like rain falling through the pale yellow cone of a street lamp at night. There was no other soul about, and neither bird nor beast in sight. At length, he rose and started off towards the science block, then stopped. He closed his eyes and lifted his face to the sky, letting the rain course down his cheeks. It felt cold, calming, a palliative to ease, if only briefly, the seething turmoil of his mind. He saw then, in the vast estate of darkness that unfolded behind his eyes, the vaster, more antique darkness of the Bat House. An alien dark, and now a familiar one that encompassed the whole of his consciousness. A pale and lithesome thing crabbing sideways on loose-joined hands and knees, swinging its head this way and that, and tasting the air with slitted nostrils. Injured, burned, hidden from the hateful sun, emerging from the utter blackness like some surreal translucent fish rising from pelagic depths. Its blind sockets hovered mere inches from where he crouched in a protective buttress of grayish-purple dusk light falling through the lone window high in the western wall. In the glass cage of its chest, he could see the strange flat book of its lungs, its darkly pulsing heart. Bradley. Bradley. Bradley! He opened his eyes. Mr. James, his science teacher, beckoned from a nearby doorway, expression bewildered behind black Woody Allen glasses. "What are you playing at?" he asked as Bradley trudged soddenly along beside him, bedraggled and mud-slathered and absolutely soaked, as if he were the sole grim survivor of some latter-day biblical flood engendered by God himself to cleanse this world that he had created, but that would no longer oblige his bidding. "Look at the state of you," Mr. James continued, shaking his head. "You're like a drowned rat. And what's happened to your glasses?" Bradley grinned and shook his head and said nothing. No. Not a rat. He scarce could tell where his being ended and that of the thing in the Bat House began, nor did he any longer care. He guessed that the truth of the matter was darker yet, as such truths are wont to be. Neither did he know the name for this sudden encapture of darkness within his beating heart, but he nursed it nonetheless, kept its tenebrous flame like some tonsured friar of yore, attendant to the frail light of his votive lamp, making holy inquiry of whatever god or deity was willing to be inquired of. Morphons boundless in form and meant for other mediums than this. Things that watch, that wait, that prowl the nether dark where each and all must wander soon or late. He sat down at the back of the classroom and took off his coat and hung it on the back of his chair. Mr. James vanished into the corridor, then reappeared, wheeling a creaky overhead projector. Set it up, dim the lights. You there, pull down the blinds at the back. See a time-lapse film of rusted walls ribbed with fast-spreading molds. Annular shapes, vibrant in color and aspect both. Blacker spores gnawing outwards like cigarette burns in a tawdry reel of film. A car-struck badger rotting by the roadside, Stiff gray fur scalloped with serrate growths and pulpy white clusters of fungi sprouting incessantly among the lifeless folds of its flesh. Their industrious mutations, festering in the lightless interstices, the thin and fluted regions that exist between marrow and dust. Bradley stared at the furry growths spreading across the screen. The titanic bats. The antique church. Soon, he thought. Soon. It was 20 till 4 that afternoon when George and Lucas finally emerged onto the footpath ahead of him, laughing, smoking, stopping to spit at a big ginger tomcat that hissed and promptly vanished over a fence. The first rock, with its freight of pent-up anger, struck Lucas with such force that it spun him sideways and against a low brick wall. The second rock hit George dead center in the stomach as he turned to see, folding him up like something with hinges. Bradley let fall his armful of rocks and stood and waited for the pair to partially recover themselves. Then, just as Lucas's enraged eyes locked with his, he turned and set off at a dead run down the road and past the garage, half stumbling around a corner and through the gridlocked crawl of after-school traffic and on towards the woods. He could hear car horns blaring behind him, and by the time he reached the first of the trees and ran on into them, he could hear enraged voices shouting threats and insults and elaborate invectives. What punishment lay ahead was going to be long-winded and extremely painful, the voices informed him. His facial features would be rearranged to the point of anonymity, his bloody testes severed with who knew what cruel implement. No sanctuary nor hiding place in this world or any other for such doomed souls as he. He moved quickly through the trees while the day waned, down leaf-paved paths he'd come to know as well as the veins in his hand. The sky beyond the bare branches flushed red, then gold, and he could more sense than see the last of the light gathering in the west. The sun, by some sorcery or by some darker intercession, wrenched from its right course, and so condemned to premature endarkenment. The woods were at once sepulchral and sacred, imbued with a grain and quality of light reminiscent of that which shines through stained glass saints on bright midwinter days. Now and then he paused to listen and to compass his pursuers, to hear their voices, to urge them on. After a few more minutes, he came out of the woods, looking covertly all about, and darted across the clearing to the bat house. Bats were tolling out of the dusk, and the dying sun was bleeding out all over a jagged tree line that looked as stark and dimensionless as something burned into wood. By now, Bradley was panting and lightheaded, his breath coming hard and fugitive like some small, evasive animal he could barely grasp. But when he reached the base of the ladder, he did not pause, nor did he hesitate, but simply began to climb. Lucas stumbled out of the trees with George floundering on the slope behind him. His shoulder throbbed fiercely, and his legs ached from running, but his anger was like metal, heated blue-white by whatever internal forge shaped his passions, and he would not allow it any chance to cool. "Come on," he called, glancing back at George where he staggered upright over the crest of the slope like some rough prototype of Adam rising from the primordial slime. "We've got to get that motherfuck!" Lucas had halted. There was a stunned and vaguely disoriented expression on his face. A building loomed above him like the very negation of light itself, a dark shape whose features he could not discern save for 4 slender legs rising into the air, and the bulk of a house set atop them at what he thought must be 60 or 70 feet high. He didn't know what it was. Some sort of lookout post, perhaps. Or maybe a house for birds or wildlife preservation. It seemed to him to have been constructed from obsidian, or some other smooth black stone that gleamed not in the last of the light, but drank it, as if all the world's disparate darks had here been given home in concrete form. All the preterite darks of epochs gone, of mankind's storied past. The ancient dark of Mesopotamia, and the dark of rock-cut Ptolemaic tombs. The dark of Henge and Ziggurat, of Barrow, cairn, and tumulus. What's that? At the sound of George's voice, the fugue released him, and he shook his head, confused, brain fogged with names and images he neither knew nor recognized. The lizard in him hissed a warning. Then the ape resumed operation. "Don't know," he said, "but look." A ragged trail trodden through the damp carpet of leaves. They followed it to the base of the ladder, then stopped and looked at each other and craned their necks to peer up at the underside of the building. There was silence, and then the silence was broken by a long, drawn-out creak. Something pale flashed briefly, then subsided into the shadows like the back of a fish surfacing in a murky pond, or a bloodless visage composed behind darkened glass. Was that? Yeah, had to be. Shit. We've got to get that fucker. I know. Right, let's go. George nodded, then glanced at the ladder with caged nervousness. By now, the ape was banging its drum in brute anticipation. "Fuck's sake," said Lucas, pushing George aside. "Get out of the way!" The further he climbed, the smaller the trees below became, like plastic trees disposed upon a train table, a model landscape beheld from above. His hands ached, and his shoulder did too, but he was more worried about his feet, for his shoe soles were very wet and worn so smooth as to have little grip. He decided he'd grab onto George if he did fall. At least that way he wouldn't go alone. He glanced down to check on the other boy's progress and was seized with a sudden loathing, a maniacal urge to lash out with his foot and send him plummeting to the distant world below. He'd hide the body in some slimy bed of leaves, or in a wild copse where the branches bowered blackly even in the blazing days of summer. Hidden glades, known only to Cernunnos and Pan, to the most ancillary disciples of those sprawling woods. When Lucas neared the top of the ladder, he paused. There was a narrow hatch, and the hatch hung open, and something emerged from within. Fuck! He almost raised a hand to slap the bat away, but fought back the urge and turned his head to one side with the ladder rung locked in his fingers, watching the dark, furry shape fold its wings and dive and veer away on some esoteric isobar of its own devising. "Was that a bat?" George called from beneath him, a subtle edge of panic to his voice. Lucas ignored him. He was almost at the hatch now, was hauling himself up into its Stygian depths. "Where the fuck are you?" he screamed, shattering a horde of silence as dense as water, and so violating the careful ceremonies of stillness and shadow, the solemn rites enacted in that cloistral dark. And what malevolent intelligences left aghast and speechless at this willful desecration? What blighted gods and demiurges? Things of which the histories of man have heard but whispered rumor. Things unknowable and rarely beheld. For what witness could survive such a witnessing without being himself sublimated to the abyss therein? He waited. The darkness breathed and fluttered, a darkness inlaid with fang and wing. His eyes couldn't see anything but the ruby fire glint of myriad eyes. "Get out here!" he said shrilly, his voice tending away into the utter blackness like an echo relayed down Spelian depths. There was a flash of movement in his periphery. A shape reared briefly out of the dark, then vanished back into the deeper gloom. It was pale and naked, and its achromatic skin oddly luminous like something cellophane wrapped, or the gossamer flesh of a jellyfish, inexplicably fashioned into a vaguely human likeness by some demented cosmetic surgeon. "There he is," said George, striding past him. "Over there." "No, wait!" But George was gone. Lucas stood for a moment, deciding whether or not to follow him, whether to stay or to flee. Then, someone screamed. A harsh, terror-stricken sound that bristled every hair on his body and was snatched away to silence as suddenly as it had begun. This was followed by other noises, a sharp crack and a thick, fleshy ripping like someone tearing a leg off a chicken. The air flushed with a harsh red tang of iron. Something hit the floor with a loud, meaty thud and came bumping through the darkness towards him. "Oh shit! Oh shit! Oh shit!" He stumbled backwards and nearly stepped straight through the open hatch. He felt sick. A chasm of unreckonable depth had opened up inside of him. He looked first at the hatch and the yawning void below, and then at the wall of darkness coagulating about him, and the head severed at the neck, which had come rolling out of it. His gorge rose warm and acidic in the back of his throat, and in that long, elastic interval of dread, he thought he might have seen death come up in George's eyes like a face at a window at night, or perhaps his soul sucked out of them in ectoplasmic volution. But what he saw was nothing at all, save the ravening maw of nothingness itself. As he stared with equal portions of horror and fascination, the pale shape crept forward on all fours to the very edge of the light, dark blood slathering its foul, translucent flesh. It lifted its head and pressed its face into his, and then the light vanished, and the bats went berserk. Beyond the walls of the bat house, the sun burned cool and red. Bradley climbed down the ladder and walked across the clearing towards the black autumn trees where they stood in an ossified frieze against the moon-silvered depths of night. A huge bone-colored disk of moon was just clearing the horizon above the tree line, and it looked, for all the world, like a bunghole to some midnight realm beyond. And when he paused at the edge of the trees with the light shining on him, and through him, he turned to look back and saw the bat house stamped in dimensionless silhouette against the star-blown heavens. Secret, heraldic, dark as anything that ever was, its baleful incumbents frenzied and riotous in the wake of the night-killed sun. You've been listening to The Bat House by Tom Farr. Tom Farr is a British writer of horror and weird fiction. Sometimes he writes poems, too. He has traveled extensively throughout China and Japan, and credits the works of Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft as inspiration for his writing, as well as Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves, which is a personal favorite of mine, listeners, and Daniel Myrick's The Blair Witch Project for his interest in experimental works of horror. When he isn't reading or writing, he's usually cycling or trying to improve his 5 and 10 kilometer run times. Either that or he's playing Dark Souls, also a favorite of mine, listeners. He's new to Twitter and doesn't know how to use it yet, but you can hopefully reach him at tfarrhorror. That's TFARRHORROR. Thank you so much for tuning in this evening to get Season 7 started. I'm your host, Erik Peabody, and I'll see you right here at this same time next week. Just hope that you see me before I see you. If you enjoyed what you've heard on today's program, please take a moment to stop by our iTunes page, or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts, and leave us a 5-star review and a kind word. It makes a huge difference and would mean a lot to me. If you'd like to hear a premium, ad-free edition of tonight's and all of our other episodes, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can become a patron for as little as $5 per month and get access to our entire audio archive dating back to 2012, including past episodes of this program, all of our other shows, and hundreds of standalone releases, all of them ad-free and available to download or stream. Thanks so much for your time and for giving our sponsors a try today. When you support our sponsors, you help support this show, and that means a lot to me. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, you can follow and subscribe to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all of our latest updates and new releases and have the chance to interact with us each and every week. As for me personally, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, username Viking Guitar, and also on Instagram as Viking Guitar Productions. Until next week, listener, when we meet up once again atop the horror hill for yet another dance with darkness, I bid you good night. Sleep tight, listener, and whatever you do, if you hear scratching at your door, don't open it. The darkness may have found you, but it's up to you to let it in. And now, a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp Online Therapy wants to remind you to prioritize yourself. Talking with someone can help you figure out what's causing stress in your life. And if you already know the source of stress, BetterHelp can help you find ways to cope and deal with it. School's back in session for the kiddos, meaning that there's more time than ever to be alone with your thoughts. And that's not always a good thing. Sure, there are other ways to occupy your time, such as games, nature walks, hobbies, and the like. I like to read a good book or listen to my favorite podcast. But it feels so good to be open and honest, two of the many ingredients needed for better mental health. And I love how my BetterHelp therapist provides me with the distance and semi-anonymity to do just that. BetterHelp is real, professional counseling tailored to your needs that you can do online. It's more affordable than traditional therapy, and for those who need it, financial aid is available, meaning the people who need it most can have better access to help that's, well, better. Thanks to BetterHelp, it's never been easier for me or others to care for their mental health. All you have to do is take the first step. Most anyone can benefit from counseling, whether it's depression, anxiety, internal struggles, or any other problem standing in your way. BetterHelp is the tried and true tool to get you up to task again. This is no gimmick, folks. It's professional therapy online, quick, discreet, convenient, and at a price that's attainable. Here's how it works. Within 48 hours of signing up, you'll be communicating with your own licensed therapist who specializes in your specific needs. You can reach out anytime and receive timely, thoughtful responses. You can also schedule weekly phone or video sessions at your convenience. In short, you'll never be winging it again. Your personal counselor will always be close at hand. No office visits necessary. It's professional help right in your pocket. Not a fan of being on screen? That's okay. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. And remember, you can be matched with a therapist in under 48 hours. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/horrorhill. That's BETTERHELP.com/horrorhill. Thank you for your support and for supporting our valuable sponsors. You've been listening to the Horror Hill Podcast, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcast Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's episode was hosted by, and its featured tale performed by, yours truly, Erik Peabody. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Nikki McSorley and Erik Peabody. Finalization by
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.